"It's gorgeous," Ophelia whispered, her voice nearly lost beneath the sound of violins from the radio. "It's a fraud." Oscar huffed and waved his hand at the painting. Ophelia leaned closer to the canvas, admiring the texture of the paint, the illusion of depth and solidity it gave to the lace of the First Lady's saffron dress and gloves, the smooth brush strokes evoking pristine marble columns behind her. Ophelia marvelled at the subtle yet exquisite use of light and shading, the soft glow of the subject's eyes and the shadows cast by the idealized curves of her body. But the beauty it conveys, the sense of grace and dignity— "Lies upon lies," Oscar interrupted. "Have you ever seen the First Lady in person? Her jaundiced eyes are haunted by madness, her yellowing skin sagged from her bones, and her dark hair is like scorched straw." "If it's a lie, at least it's a beautiful one," Ophelia offered. Oscar tugged at his messy shock of hair and pointed an accusing finger at the painting. "Art is supposed to tell the truth, even when it lies. There's no honesty in this. It says nothing. It asks nothing. Nothing other than, 'Where is my commission?'" Ophelia placed a hand on Oscar's shoulder and brought her face close to his. She gave him the look that she always did when he had these fits, an expression that conveyed patience, admiration, and more than a little bemusement. "Oscar, you're too hard on yourself. You are a master painter and a gifted sculptor. You hold the highest position that a man of your talents and disposition could hope to possess. You are the darling of the Ministry of Aesthetics, one of the most respected artists in the world." "Ah, am I even an artist?" The music faded, the violin sonata giving way to a news brief. A troubled voice, that of News Minister Robert Welch, Jr., came over the radio demanding the couple's attention. Welch reported increasing civil unrest and chaotic protests over the wars in Vietnam and Cambodia. Protests that had started in mainland America, but were now erupting in cities all over the empire, as far as Paris and Berlin. Anarchists were defiling public art and performing outlaw music, and rabble-rousers were screeching slogans of hate and heresy over megaphones. "Do you hear that?" Ophelia asked, pointing toward the radio. "Your work is one of the pillars that keep our society from descending into that kind of madness. It gives people something to strive for, Oscar." Oscar looked at his painting of the First Lady. The technique was flawless, and there was an undeniable beauty in the lies he had rendered across the canvas. Still, it was hollow and meaningless. "Perhaps there is more truth in madness than we care to admit." Oscar wore his shabbiest suit, a relic from his days at art school some 20 years prior. The wrinkled shirt beneath his sport coat was only buttoned halfway, revealing a dark patch of chest hair spotted with the occasional strand of silver. Even so, he stood out as overdressed among the hippies and outcasts of the Vision, an underground mix of speakeasy, music hall, and art gallery. He was surprised they had even let him in. These anti-establishment artists would surely revile him and his work. Luckily, his face was less famous than his name. The place stank. A vile potpourri of body odour, cigarettes, reefer, and moonshine. To his left, a group of outsider artists and hangers-on mingled around an ugly abstract sculpture, barely more than a hunk of lazily shaped plaster. On the wall to his left hung a series of collages, mixed media clipped from newspapers and film negatives splattered with day-glow paint. A naked girl stood like a statue on a makeshift stage, while idiot college boys painted nonsense slogans and cartoon flowers on her flesh. Oscar took a shot of moonshine from a topless waitress who walked by and handed her a $5 bill. She fiddled for change, but he waved her off and pushed his way through the crowd. His eyes darted from one amateur work to another. He had hoped that the madness and the passion of these misfits might lend him some inspiration. He had hoped to lay his eyes on something striking and original. He had hoped to find the raw essence of art. What Oscar created might be uninspired, but what he found in The Vision was absolute drivel. Each piece was as pretentious as it was ugly, the creations of spoiled children, desperate to make a statement despite having nothing to say. Philistines and hypocrites, one and all. Young men and women screeching about the evils of war, while reaping the security and comfort brought on by the Empire's military superiority. A break in the crowd opened, and an image at the far end of the room caught Oscar's attention. He didn't have time to process what he was seeing before someone stepped into his line of sight, blocking his view. But just a glimpse of the composition and colour left him dumbstruck and teary-eyed. The evocative colours and strange geometries snared his mind. Oscar pushed through the clusters of people, mumbling insincere apologies. There were occasional breaks in the crowd, moments less than a second long, where he could glimpse the image as he strove toward it. Each stolen glance was like a thunderstrike, rumbling his soul and electrifying his neurons. He made it through the crowd and to the far end of the room. On the wall, unframed and painted on a cheap canvas panel, was the single most beautiful vision Oscar had ever seen. The subject matter was odd and alien. Twin suns, some shade of blue Oscar could not name, setting behind a still body of dark water. A colour he had never seen materialized where the suns reflected on the water, and black stars burned holes in the mustard gas sky. Distorted penumbras encircled those stars, as if they were sucking the colour of the foreign welkin into the gravity of their unlight. It wasn't just what was depicted that enraptured Oscar. It was the technique and composition, the use of colour, space and texture. The brushstrokes were frenzied and passionate, without sacrificing technique or aesthetic. Shadows stretched from rocky outcroppings, defining a perspective that seemed skewed and natural all at once. Enthralled or disgusted? Oscar jumped at the voice. He turned to find an older man behind him, perhaps in his 60s, ancient compared to the 20-somethings that filled the speakeasy. His hair was long and white, the upper section tied back, while the rest hung loose about his shoulders. The V-neck of his linen shirt stretched halfway down his chest, revealing a brand on his sternum. Puffy and sickly yellow, the scarified flesh depicted an exotic glyph. Oscar could not guess its origin. "Enthralled," Oscar replied. "It's yours?" "I painted it, but it isn't mine. It belongs to all who find resonance within it." "What are the colours? What tints did you use to make them?" "I only painted what I saw. I drew from the palette of Carcosa." Carcosa? The name was familiar, but Oscar couldn't place it. It rattled in his head, a loose piece of trivia he couldn't grasp. Before Oscar could inquire further, the door to the Vision burst open, sending the doorman careening through a group of drunken youths. Coarse voices called out frenzied orders. Metal canisters rolled in through the doorway, each expelling clouds of yellow smoke. The crowd erupted into panic. Oscar recognized the gas. It was the same chemical weapon from the newsreels, the one that had helped win the war against Germany in the transformative days of the Empire, airdropped over Paris in the 40s, and used against the communists in Vietnam and Cambodia today. It was a terrifying and unpredictable weapon, fatal to many on contact, but condemning others to slow deaths as their lungs blackened and shriveled in their chests. Others still would go mad and take their own lives within days or weeks of exposure. The people nearest the door choked on the yellow mist. Some collapsed. Others stumbled for an escape route. A few stood transfixed, breathing deeply of the tainted air. Black-clad riot officers in gas masks rushed across the threshold, striking the young patrons of the speakeasy with fists and batons. One of the cops clubbed the bartender and went about smashing bottles of moonshine and overturning kegs. Others kicked over statues, bashed holes through painted canvas, and hastily blacked out photographs with spray paint. Oscar did not regard all art as sacred, as some artists might. He did not even regard most of the work in the Vision as art. His heart sank knowing that the riot officers would heed no mind to the difference between the garbage they were destroying and the strange masterpiece he had only just discovered. "We should go," Oscar muttered to the artist of the painting. The other man stood transfixed on the violence and the expanding, jaundiced cloud. "Carcosa," he muttered, stepping toward the toxic gas and violent frenzy. "That gas will kill you. Those men will kill you. We need to go." The artist ignored Oscar's warnings. He leaned forward and inhaled the lethal mist, a look of exultation settling over his haggard features. "Carcosa." An officer stepped through the yellow cloud, a black demon marching through the sandstorm of some desert hellscape. The cop raised his baton and brought it down on the artist's skull. The sound was sickening, a wet pop. The artist collapsed, his white hair turning red. Oscar covered his nose and mouth with a pocket square, then snatched the painting from the wall. He had so many questions for the artist. He had so much to learn from him. That opportunity was gone now, but he could still save the work. His eyes darted from one side of the speakeasy to the other, scanning for some back door or secret exit. It was impossible to see through the clouds of poison gas. Oscar retreated to the wall and moved about the perimeter of the room. He hoped to stay out of the fray, away from the gas, and to stumble upon an exit. In the periphery of his vision, Oscar saw a man slip through a wall. He turned and the man was gone, but a tapestry fluttered, revealing a passageway behind it. His shoulder pressed to the wall, Oscar rushed for the exit. If the gas caught up to him, it would not care that he was the darling of the Ministry of Aesthetics. Also, he was not so famous that the riot police would recognize him and give him a pass based on his station. Worse still, perhaps they would know his face and deem him a traitor for muddling about a haven of depravity. Oscar slipped past a tapestry and stumbled into a dim passageway. A young man staggered along in the space ahead of Oscar. He leaned on the wall and muttered to himself as he shambled forward. Oscar skirted around the young man, noting his glistening skin, his sweat-drenched clothes, and the trembling of his limbs. The boy's facial muscles twitched, independently and out of sync with one another. Light bathed the passageway. Oscar looked back to see the black silhouette of a riot officer casting away the tapestry. Shit! Oscar ran forward. He saw a door up ahead, illuminated by the yellow-filtered light of the speakeasy. The footsteps of heavy boots on concrete echoed in the narrow space, making it impossible to gauge how far behind the officer was. The footfalls stopped just for a moment, and gave way to a sickening crack and a moan that died into a gurgle. Tucking the painting under his right arm, Oscar rammed the door with his left shoulder. A shock wave of pain radiated through his body as he bounced off the heavy wood and fell on his behind, dropping the painting. He stumbled to his feet and fumbled with the latch, but the deadbolt required a key. Oscar turned and leaned back against the door. The riot officer marched toward him, blood dripping from his baton. My name is Oscar Gautier. I'm an artist for the Ministry of Aesthetics." Oscar motioned toward his jacket. "I'm here to examine the extent to which degenerate art has infected the youth." The riot officer stopped. He retrieved a flashlight from his belt and shined it at Oscar. He stayed silent, but tilted his head as if in thought. "May I reach into my pocket and fetch my identification?" The officer said nothing but put away his baton. Oscar took this as consent and retrieved his wallet. He flipped it open to reveal his imperial identification card and raised his hands above his head. The officer snatched the wallet from him and examined the ID under the flashlight's beam. Oscar couldn't read the officer's expression through his mask. Even the lenses were tinted, giving no glimpse of his eyes. The silent tension was made worse by the muffled sounds of violence drifting into the passageway. Oscar swallowed hard, waiting for some response. The officer shoved the wallet into Oscar's chest, then pushed him aside. With two swift kicks, the doorframe splintered and the door burst open, revealing familiar lights of the New York skyline. "Go home. You are never here." The officer headed back into the vision. Oscar snatched the painting from the ground and ran off into the night. Oscar had barely slept since he came home from the vision nights before. He'd gone directly to work trying to understand and emulate the odd and beautiful painting he had liberated. His compulsion had proven fruitless. Piles of faded studies littered a desk alongside discarded palettes covered in dozens of terrestrial shades of blue. He couldn't mimic the surreal perspective of the shadows, nor the nameless colours of the implied light. 3 easels were lined up, each facing the east side windows. The painting from The Vision, that outre masterpiece, sat in the centre. The canvases to the left and right were failed imitations of that incredible work. It wasn't just the fact that Oscar couldn't quite emulate the eccentric style. His work lacked some ephemeral quality that made the original shine. It was no surprise that his was lacking, Oscar considered. Whatever muse had struck the original artist was unknown to Oscar. His pieces were imitations of an imitation. Oscar looked at the original painting and sighed with admiration. He traced the signature in the lower corner, the same curvaceous yellow sigil that had been branded upon the artist's chest, and cursed the man for not signing his given name. Carcosa. The artist at The Vision said he drew from the palette of Carcosa. The name slithered through Oscar's mind, a slick eel of a memory constantly slipping from his grasp. Oscar hung his smock on a hook and went down to his library on the first floor of his Harlem brownstone. He passed the next several hours leafing through books on mythology, art, and music, unsure in which sphere of his interest he had come across the term Carcosa. He finally discovered a reference to it in a volume of essays about banned books and degenerate art. Carcosa was a fictional world from an underground play called The King in Yellow. The play, which had enjoyed something of a cult following in the earlier part of the century, had been banned by the Empire back in the 1920s. There was an almost superstitious fervour around the piece, both from its proponents and its detractors. Outlaw artists and social outliers claimed that it was the supreme essence of art, whilst the government had decreed it an existential threat to decency and sanity. Oscar found both claims dramatic, to say the least, but the American Empire did love to make things more than what they seemed. That was the entire basis of his service to them. To make genocidal pencil pushers into warriors of legend, and a corrupt bureaucracy into something akin to Camelot, at least in the minds of the people. Whatever the truth of The King in Yellow was, it must have been the inspiration for the painting he had saved. The book that mentioned it had precious little information, speculations on the world of Carcosa, the names of a few characters, and variations of several lines unmoored by context. There were also a few paragraphs about conspiracy theories surrounding the play. One claimed that it was weaponized art, created by the Germans in the Great War to drive America mad. Another, more esoteric claim was that the play reflected the true nature of reality and could awaken those with Carcosan blood. An offshoot of this theory claimed that the imperial dynasty of America was formed to secure and protect that alien bloodline. All copies of The King in Yellow had been destroyed by the Empire. That was the official statement, at least. If the government had kept any copies of the play intact, they would be locked away, too deeply for Oscar to access even with his influence and connections. The only choice was to ascertain who the artist was. The man might not have signed his name, but anonymity was not an easy thing to come by in the American Empire. Someone knew who he was, and Oscar would find out. The artist from the vision was named Benjamin Duke, and he was a distant cousin of none other than the Emperor. Oscar also learned that Duke was still alive. Presumably that familial tie had saved him from being summarily shot. Nepotism only went so far, however, and Duke was still in an unenviable situation. He currently resided in a cell on Rikers Island, charged with resisting arrest, disorderly conduct, gross degeneracy, and corruption of the youth. Oscar had learnt all this from Clint Bierce, an acquaintance in the corrections department who advocated art therapy as a means of criminal rehabilitation. His idea of art was the beautiful but shallow propaganda of the state, so naturally he admired Oscar's work. Bierce had arranged for Oscar to interview Duke, though he couldn't understand why someone of Oscar's caliber would have any interest in the work of a degenerate street artist. The prison on Rikers Island lived up to the rest of New York City's aesthetic standards. Concrete walls with a marble veneer stretched 20 feet high around the facility grounds. Monolithic statues that Oscar had designed stood on either side of the main entrance. To the left was Lady Justice, blindfolded and holding her scales and sword. To the right stood the well-muscled and stoic-faced image of Ponos, god of labour and toil. Once past the gates, Oscar was escorted to a visiting room. Clint Bierce gave him a 10-cent tour along the way, pointing out the many progressive features that had been worked into the prison. There was a spiritual re-education centre for those who may have been led to a life of crime by savage, un-Christian faiths. A factory and workyard provided inmates the opportunity to learn the value of hard labour and of giving back to the Empire. There was even a lethal chamber for the prisoners who could no longer carry the burden of their sins. Oscar, charming and likeable when it suited him, smiled and feigned interest in Bierce's tour of the prison. In truth, it bored him. Bureaucracy and justice were too mundane to hold his attention. He was relieved to reach the visiting room where Bierce left him, and Duke alone to talk. Duke's hands and feet were shackled to the chair. His head had been shaved, and his skull was bandaged where he'd been struck. Despite his grim circumstances, Duke's smile seemed genuine.
"Mr. Gautier, A pleasure to see you again.
So you know me?
You are perhaps the most famous artist in the world. How could I not?
Oscar swallowed. For some reason he couldn't put his finger on, it made Oscar uncomfortable that Duke knew who he was. I wanted to ask about the painting. The one of the lake. The one with the two suns.
Then ask, Duke said with a smirk.
How? How did you make those colours? How did you render that disorientating perspective and the strange geometry of the shadows? What was your muse?
I told you when last we spoke, Mr. Gautier. I drew from the palette of Carcosa. The beauty of that lost world was my muse.
Carcosa is an imaginary place, derived from a play that no living man has seen or read.
The King in Yellow is still performed for those with eyes to see. Casilda's song is played for those with ears to hear.
Duke tapped his chest where Oscar had spotted his strange brand the other night.
For those who bear the yellow sign.
Where? Where did you see the play? Oscar looked at the decaying remnants of the Strand Theatre and considered the fact that he might be mad. What other explanation was there for him travelling to a derelict theatre in Brooklyn in hopes of seeing a performance of a play that had been suppressed decades ago? Crazier still, this was Oscar's second trip to the Strand. His first had been just hours after his conversation with Benjamin Duke. The place had felt sinister then. Perhaps it was the paranoid idea that something monstrous lurked in the darkness beyond the boarded glass doors. Or maybe it was the blank marquee that made Oscar uneasy. A symbol of the nothingness that awaits us all. Ultimately, there was nothing to be afraid of. The place had been empty, as any rational person would expect. One detail alone had influenced Oscar to return. An interior door painted with the symbol that Duke bore on his chest. Duke's words had echoed in his mind upon seeing the odd seal.
The King in Yellow is still performed for those with eyes to see. Casilda's song is played for those with ears to hear. For those who bear the yellow sign.
Oscar unbuttoned his shirt as he approached the door to the theatre. He revealed a sigil painted in gold across his chest, the same symbol that Duke had used to brand his art and his flesh. Carcosa. He muttered the word, his intent somewhere between a wish and a prayer, then crossed the threshold. The darkness of the standing room and orchestra gave way to ambient light with no discernible source. The torn grey curtain opened, revealing not the wreckage of a crumbling theatre, or even some elaborate set, but a window to another world. A woman of incredible and inhuman beauty stood in the waters of an endless lake. A real lake, not a pool or a set-piece. Twin suns set behind her, burning in impossible hues against an amber sky dotted with hungry black stars. This was no backdrop. This was reality, unfiltered. The woman spoke, her voice putting all earthly music to shame. Oscar wept, unable to take his eyes from the spectacle before him. He didn't notice the elongated shadows rippling through the theatre, devouring the floor and the seats, leaving xanthous sand where they touched. He didn't care about the terrible pain as the symbol painted upon his chest smouldered and blistered. The Metropolitan Museum of Art had never seen a busier day. It wasn't just New Yorkers who flocked to see Oscar's new exhibit. Art lovers from across the empire had made the pilgrimage to see the unveiling of what he'd promised would be his masterpiece. No one had yet laid eyes on the new exhibit. not the curators of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, not the Minister of Aesthetics, not even the Emperor himself. This was the condition that Oscar had demanded. The only exception had been Ophelia. It had proved too much for her, sadly. Within hours of seeing Oscar's masterpiece, just in part, she strolled down to the lethal chamber on 42nd Street and ended her life. Oscar watched the patrons of the museum from a balcony where he stood like a statue, clad in yellow robes. His eyes followed their movements from behind his pallid mask. The installation was an immersive mixed-media experience, all designed and implemented by Oscar alone. He had painted the murals, designed the lighting, placed the sculptures, and even engineered the delivery system for the gas that would soon flow. The process had taken months, but it was worth it. This was not the beautiful lie of propaganda. It was not a derivative attempt to imitate Duke's painting. This was what he'd been born for. The voluminous sleeves of Oscar's robe hid the trigger in his hand. He squeezed it, and yellow gas bubbled up from pools of water and breathed out from the mouths of idyllic statues. The gas would grant the museum-goers a deeper appreciation for the art. It would allow them to see colours from beyond this world, hues from the palette of Carcosa. Of course there were those who could not handle the beauty of such pure art. Many panicked and ran for the exits. Cowards and curs. A few others gouged out their eyes or fell trembling to the ground, their shabby souls so unfamiliar with greatness that the sight of it terrified them. Others were overwhelmed with raw emotion, descending upon one another to fuck and kill. Most of these people would die here, or be driven to their end within a few days. There were those few souls who calmly wept at the beauty of Oscar's art. These men and women, their minds taken to some far-off world through image and aesthetic, would live transcendent lives ever after. And was transcendence not the supreme essence of art? Duke had been right. Carcosa did not belong to him or Oscar or even the Emperor, who Oscar now realized wished to hoard its beautiful secrets. No, the legacy of that doomed world belonged to everyone. Oscar would be the man to share it. He would paint the yellow sign upon the whole of mankind.